Zuma, now the South African ruling party, the African National Congress, took to the stands of the Moses Mabhida Stadium last week to announce the set of promises and goals in the party manifesto. Joining me via Skype to go over the particulars is Peter Montalto, head of capital markets research over at Intellidex. Peter, good to have you on the show. It was a quite interesting release, your review and insights on the entire manifesto away from the theme. You do allude to the fact that this kind of sounds like the 2014 manifesto that was rolled out. Tell me, why do you say this?
Well, the interesting thing about the 2014 manifesto was that it was very backward-looking, was about delivery on so many key areas such as electricity, housing, access to clinics, things like that, and then started to sort of link forward to future policies, but in a not particularly new or sort of dramatic way, I think. And that's basically the replica of what we've had now, where we've seen this sort of toing and froing between past delivery and future potential promises. And I think that's very much going to be the tone of the debate around the election between the parties on how much the ANC has or has not delivered and what they can actually do in the future.
Right. If we're to talk about the issue with the jobs, recent surveys have showed that South Africa's youth unemployment is hovering just between 63 and 65%. Overall unemployment, 27%. Definitely jobs are a big issue here. And you do touch on this, mentioning that, well, it's kind of a copy and paste from the Jobs Summit. Just shed some more light on this.
Exactly. Well, the problem with the Jobs Summit was that whilst it got all the usual suspects together, it didn't come up with any mindset change. And I think the problem is the scale of unemployment is so large in South Africa, you need a full mindset change in terms of how the labour market works to fundamentally target anything reasonable, like 5% unemployment in the long term, whether that's 20 years or whatever. And that wasn't in the outcomes from the Jobs Summit, and it wasn't in the manifesto either. So all these issues that have been put in the manifesto on jobs are fine, they're good, they're all increasing technical education, these sorts of things, greater opportunities for internships and removing some skill barriers to entry. But really, this is all running to stand still. We have to remember that the labour force is ever expanding, and we're just simply running to catch up at this point. And as a result, we still see unemployment grinding a little bit higher in the coming year or two.
Let's talk about the role of the born freeze in this 2019 poll. Again, lots of rhetoric over the weekend on provision of electricity, housing, and these are things that many of the born freeze, well, to be honest, have no understanding retrospectively because maybe they were not around. Is this something that might actually not have as much weight as the ANC thinks it does come the 2019 poll?
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I think that focus on delivery in the past really comes down to targeting middle-class, middle-aged voters who did experience, obviously, life under apartheid and know the difference. Whereas, as you say, the youth want something else, and I think this comes back to the fundamental issue of what would any other government in the ANC's place have done? Where do you set the bar? Obviously, if you set the bar super low, you're going to surpass it. And I think the key factor here is we make a lazy assumption on born frees that they won't turn out for the election in any great numbers at all. They won't register and then they won't turn out. That's a lazy assumption. It's very hard to test that, obviously, before the actual event, given scarcity of polling in South Africa. But the broad idea that there isn't really a home for the born frees in terms of where they can go and vote for, I think is still very much true.
Right. An interesting point here that was, of course, alluded to is the issue on land reform. Now, as opposed to a previous commentary here, one thing that you do highlight here is a kind of a change in the tone. And when it comes to land reform here, it's talking about sustainable and radical land reform. Now, this creates a few issues, at least on your end. Do you get the sense that there is more focus on agribusiness going forward and maybe supply chains as opposed to the rhetoric that was thrown around maybe 3-4 years ago?
Exactly, that was interesting. The sort of bulk of the space in the manifesto on land was taken up by these more nitty-gritty issues on agribusiness, on food supply chains. But that headline term, sustainable and radical, is sort of weird, if you like, but interesting, and I think tells us a lot about where the balance of the debate around land isn't within the ANC. They want to once appear to sort of the conservative with a small c sort of voter who's worried maybe about some of the effects on the economy, but also obviously the very large constituency around land reform policy who are interested in historic justice and issues like that. And that's going to be the key issue trying to navigate land policy after the election, is trying to marry those two things together. They may simply not be joinable, actually, thinking about the way policy will work. You're either going to have a very slow system like we've seen so far, which has been inadequate politically, or you're going to have a much faster, more radical land reform policy that will upset investors and banks and raise risks of things like corruption entering the system. And other problems around how the system is dealt with in policy uncertainty.
Peter, let's talk about the phrase of the weekend, which is in tune with Eskom. Quote unquote, reposition Eskom to play an active role in the renewable energy sector and promote public ownership in renewable energy infrastructure. Shouldn't the focus here just be work on corruption in Eskom?
Exactly. Well, I think it was an interesting balance, particularly looking at the president's speech at the gala dinner before the manifesto launch. There is certainly a recognition of the problems the ANC's had and some recognition of state capture, and the ANC is trying to balance, obviously be honest with the electorate on the one hand and not running an overly sort of self-harm negative campaign against themselves on the other. But yes, I think the interesting thing about that particular paragraph of the manifesto is it reinforces the status quo, that the Eskom is the start and stop of where energy policy is in South Africa. And actually, of course, what we've learned from REPIP and the very successful renewable policies in South Africa, this is a world-leading policy that South Africa has built, is that actually the private sector involvement and the private sector's ability to deliver in that area has surpassed anything that Eskom would have been able to. And so for me, that sentence is about mindset and the fact that, unfortunately, Eskom is still very much at the center of energy policy.
Finally, Peter, one thing that actually stands out is former President Jacob Zuma. What did you make of the proximity to the president right now, Cyril Ramaphosa? What do you make of the proximity, and maybe is this an indication of the power that the former president still wields across the country?
Well, it was interesting that he was so close at hand. There was much cutting of cake and other things going on between President Ramaphosa and former President Zuma. And I think it's understandable, certainly politically. They didn't want to have protests occurring at the or demonstrations and disruption occurring at the manifesto launch or the other events through the last week. But it does still strike you as odd when the Zondo Commission is restarting now this week, where the former president is going to be the center of attention. His name is going to keep coming up. And so I think it was a high-risk strategy. It solved some short-term political problems in terms of the manifesto launch, but it raises then some longer-term questions as well. And it comes down to sort of who won the weekend, if you like, who won the manifesto launch. And that's where I think the concern, and particularly around the mention of the SARB in the manifesto, is so important. It shows actually that there are deep factional forces and battles going on behind the scenes that is leading to some concerns from investors on things like the SARB, on prescribed assets as well, coming out in that manifesto, not just the optics and the PR of who was cutting cakes with whom.
Peter, many thanks for making time to speak to us. That was Peter Montalto joining us from London. He's, of course, the head of capital markets research at Intellidex.